This is, thank you. Somebody's told me that I'm being recorded. And the next meeting will be on Monday, June the 21st. Is that right, Tony Stoller? And he's going to talk about the BBC and musicians and things like that. Today's meeting is in memory of the late Barry and Linda Davis, who both died within the last year and who were stalwart members of our community and whom we miss a lot and whom Zalman has promised to memorialize in the way that only Zalman can. Okay, Zalman.
Thank you very much for that, Tim. I'll do my best to reflect and to explore together and to learn together. Obviously, I only met Barry and Linda in the final years of their lives. Had the privilege of standing on the bimah a number of times at Southampton Hebrew Congregation alongside Barry, sometime encouraging him to sit on the bimah while I stood. Where he was more than happy to do that on that high stool. I want to know what happened with that high stool that he used to sit on while he was leading the service in his later years. Also had the chance to navigate the art gallery that they called their home when I went to visit them on occasion. Lit Hanukkah menorah with them more than once and sat with them and supported them. And then, of course, the occasional walking across the university and seeing Barry schlepping to the chemist to get Linda some medicine. And he's huffing and puffing up the hill, and I said, Barry, you stay right here. I rushed to get my car and give him a lift. So had many sweet opportunities with both Barry and Linda in their home and in the shul, of course, as well. So when Tim, we're talking with Tim a while back, shortly after Barry passed away, and I said, you know, I think we should consider doing some talk about prayer as a memorial lecture of sorts in Barry's memory to remember the many years in which he was the unofficial chazan of the congregation and see how we can remember him in that way. So I'm going to explore prayer together today, and hopefully, I'm looking at the clock, I'll try and be finished before 8:30, maybe even a little bit earlier, doing about 40-45 minutes talk, and then if anybody has any questions or discussion, we'll take it from there. So the title that I called it today was The Origins of the Siddur, Making Sense of Daily Prayer. And of course there's the academic side of it, which I'd like to explore a little bit today. But together with that, at the same time, I'm very, very, very much aware of the fact that so many of us, and you know, some people, I don't know if people ever look at a rabbi and wonder, what is he thinking about when he's praying? Is he concentrating? Is he engaged with what he's saying, or is he just saying words as well? How do we actually make sense of daily prayer in a way that we're actually able to connect with prayer? Standing in a synagogue, you open up a prayer book, you open up a Siddur. Do we get lost? Do we get overwhelmed? Do we get a little bit puzzled by the style of language and the fact that it's not our own words? And why actually don't we use our own words if prayer is so much about using our own words? So that's what I'd like to explore today. Hopefully with an academic side to it as well, as at the end of the day this is Tim's Southampton Jewish Society lecture series, so there's got to be a bit of a lecture style presentation too, so hopefully we'll go through that as well. I'm reminded of a story that there was a rabbi in America, a modern Orthodox rabbi in America, who tells the story that many years ago, I guess sometime in the 70s, he had the opportunity to meet the Lubavitcher Rebbe, and he came into a meeting with the Rebbe and he complained to the Rebbe that he struggles during prayer. He's saying the Amidah, and he's a rabbi, and he feels very guilty that he knows the congregation think he's the leader of the congregation, and in the meantime he's thinking about stocks and shares. Well, I'm paraphrasing, but you know, whatever thoughts might pop into your head when you're standing in front of a siddur saying words that you say so frequently, and you know you're so familiar with them that you say it by rote and you don't concentrate. And so he bemoaned this difficult challenge that he had to the Rebbe. You know, I can't concentrate on what I'm saying. I find it very distracting. I'm thinking about all sorts of things. I've got the bills to pay. I've got the kids to look after and educate. I've got all sorts of mundane things that pop through my mind. And the Rebbe looked at him with a slight smile and effectively said something along the lines of, "Welcome to the club." You know, don't think that you are unique. Don't brand yourself as an evil sinner, that you can't concentrate on something that's difficult to concentrate on. If we're saying large tracts of prayer on a regular basis, it's hard to concentrate on that. It's hard to stay focused. And then the Rebbe gave him a very practical tip, which I'll share with you anyway. So I'm sharing the story. Obviously, the main point that I'm sharing is it happens to everyone, and what we need to do is find tips and skills to try and inspire us to engage a little bit more. So the Rebbe told him, for the next few weeks, focus on only one blessing of the silent Amida and think of what that prayer means to you and its meaning. It's a very short blessing. Choose one of those blessings and really connect with it for a few weeks. And the Rebbe said, naturally, after a few weeks, you will find that even if your mind is completely distracted, when you get to that blessing, your brain will kick in, you'll focus. And then build up to a second blessing. Do that for a few weeks. And then build up to a third blessing. I don't know where he's up to. This was many years ago. I don't know if he ever finished the whole Amidah. Maybe he's still working on it. I would like to suggest that he's actually still working on it, because this in life is a work of progress. And I think as we analyze the concept of prayer, we get a sense of how we can connect with it on a more meaningful level. So first of all, the term Siddur, everyone calls, of course, the prayer book for Yom Kippur is referred to as a machzor. Interesting, from the word, I believe it's from the word chazor, a cycle, because it's a festival book that is part of the Jewish cycle of the annual calendar, but it's not something that we use every single day. Why do we use the term Siddur for prayer? The word Seder, of course we know about Seder night. The word Seder means order. In fact, if we look carefully at Seder night, it's another talk that I like to give, reflecting on the fact that the Seder itself is a really brilliantly structured piece of text. The Haggadah is a really well-structured system that takes us from slavery to freedom in a couple of hours. So the word Seder means order. Anybody who knows anything about Jews and maybe Israeli politics and anything like that, I'm not allowed to talk politics on a session like this, but we may as well say it, knows that Jews aren't good at Seder. If you've ever tried to see Jews lining up at a bus stop, you know that we don't do Seder. We do it on Seder night, once a year, that's it. We don't do order at any other time of the year. But our prayer book is called Siddur. Why is it called Siddur? So here's a quote from Talmud Brachot, of course the first volume of the Talmud. Rab Simlai taught one should always set forth praise of the Holy One, blessed be He, and then pray. Before we ask for what we need, we should first set forth what we need. And the word set forth in the Talmud is yisader, to set up, to organize. So we should organize our praise of God, and then we should pray. Then we can pray. Which means that the Talmud is making a distinction between acknowledging God's greatness, praising God, versus actually praying. Praying is what we ask for our needs. Praising God is the intro, and in fact that's actually what we do in our prayers. Of course, we before we get to the silent Amidah, which is effectively where we are asking for our needs, first we have a structure of praise, and then we say the Shema, and then we can ask for what we need. And the Talmud gives an explanation, a commentary for this. From where do we know this from? From Moses. It's written, and I beseech the Lord at that time, and it is then written, Lord God, you have begun to show your servant your greatness and your strong hand, for what God is there in the heavens or on earth, or who can perform deeds such as yours in your might? And then it is written, please let me pass over and see the good land. So Moses himself, when he's praying to God for permission to enter the land after he's been told he will never be able to enter the land of Israel with his people. So first he starts off with saying, I'm going to pray. And he tells this to the Jewish people later, as we read in this text. He says, I said to God, I'm going to pray. Then he started telling God all sorts of praise and compliments of things that he thought nice about God. And then he made his request, please can I cross over? We know his request was denied, which is interesting because you can start having a whole theological discussion about whether or not prayer always is answered and doesn't need to be answered. On this occasion, the Talmud is telling us how to pray, and yet is using an example from which, as far as we know, the prayer was never answered. But it's still a good source to tell us that the word Siddur comes from this idea of organizing our prayer. And I'll come back to this term a little bit later as well. Where does the concept of prayer come from originally? So here's a quote from Maimonides, and I'm just going to make it a little bit entertaining for you and remind you that 2 Jews, 3 opinions. The opinion that you're about to read is actually not an exclusive one. There is another opinion in Jewish law which disagrees with Maimonides. According to Maimonides, it is actually a positive Torah commandment to pray every day. And he quotes from the verse, you shall serve God your Lord, va'avadatem et Hashem Elokechem, which of course we have a similar verse in the Shema. Tradition teaches us that this service is prayer as it states in the Shema, and serve him with all your heart. This is the second paragraph of the Shema. Ula'avdo b'chol levavchem. And our sages said, what is the service of the heart? It means prayer. When it says in the Shema, you should serve God with all your heart, it means prayer. And Maimonides continues, and he says that the number of prayers is not prescribed in the Torah. In other words, how many times you have to pray is not quantified in the mitzvah, in the official biblical commandment, nor does it prescribe a specific formula for prayer. So technically, in order to fulfill Maimonides' interpretation of the biblical obligation to pray, you might even be able to say, thanks for the grub, yea Lord, or whatever, the rubber dub dub, thanks for the grub, yeah? So technically you could say anything. Also, according to Torah law, there are no fixed times for prayer. So of course we know that there are fixed times for prayer in Judaism. There's a official structure, and that's all brought down in Talmud, Mishnah, Talmud, Code of Jewish Law. Maimonides says very clearly that those are rabbinic instruction, they're not a biblical obligation. According to Maimonides, the biblical obligation is to pray once a day. How you do it? Fairly open-ended. So how do we end up with a complicated Siddur with all of those prayers that we often struggle to make sense of? Why can't we just say it in our own words? And actually, many rabbis would say that from this quote, it's clear that you should include your own words as well. Find the moment to use your own language, to use your own words. Of course, we should use the official prayers that have been, as we'll discuss shortly, prayers that we've been using for 1500 years, longer, according to some opinions even 2,500 years. But at the same time, we should also use our own language to communicate with God. As I said, there's actually the opinion of the classic Rashi commentary and his disciples, the Tosafot, in that era, 10th, 11th century. They actually were of the opinion that it's not a biblical obligation to pray every single day. They said it was a rabbinic ordinance, something that the rabbis introduced, but it's not an official mitzvah. We know, of course, that there are 613 mitzvot, specific ones, and then the rabbis gave us a system with which we can connect to those mitzvot and connect to God. So here's a technical question: is prayer one of the 613? According to Maimonides, yes. According to the others, perhaps not so. Alright, so how do we end up with structured prayer? Why is it organized? So the Talmud quotes Talmud Megillah. It is taught that Shimon HaPakuli arranged the 18 blessings before Rabban Gamliel in their order in Yavne. I'm going to come back to this on a subsequent screen, but just to give you context, while I'm reading this suggests that the Amidah, the silent Amidah, the 18 blessings of the Amidah, was composed in the 1st or 2nd century. And in the Talmud continues immediately after. Rabbi Yochanan, another sage, said, and some say that it was taught in a Braita, 120 elders, among them several prophets, established 18 blessings in their order. So who were these people, and when did they live? And the answer is actually that this second quote is referring to many hundreds of years earlier. It's on the same page in Talmud. So who were these 120 people that the Talmud refers to? So we're told that this is a reference to the men of the Great Assembly, or in Hebrew, the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah, the men of the Great Assembly. Of course, we know that after Babylon, after Nebuchadnezzar and Babylon destroyed Jerusalem in approximately 500 BCE, most of the Jewish community were taken to Babylonia across the Middle East, and that's where Jewish communities lived for the next 1500 years. Yeah, well, longer. But Babylon was a primary location for the Jewish community for many hundreds of years after that first exile. So at the time of the return of the exiles, when Ezra the scribe, we know there's a book of the Tanakh, Ezra and Nehemiah, when Ezra returned to Jerusalem after the story of Purim, famous story of Purim, so a short while later the Jews returned to Jerusalem. They rebuilt the second temple. So according to the Talmud and Jewish scholarship, we're told that they established at that time a group of 120 people who were the men of the Great Assembly. Actually, very interesting, there was a majority view among these people. There was a debate among the men of the Great Assembly whether Purim should be established as a festival and whether the scroll of Esther should be included in the Bible, in the Jewish Bible, in the Tanakh. For those of you who love a drink on Purim, the good news is that Mordechai won. So we're able to celebrate Purim and have a drink. But there actually was a debate. Now, who was the debate among? It was among the men of the Great Assembly, of which Ezra was a founder. Mordechai, from the story of Purim, was one of the leading members of this men of the Great Assembly. In fact, if you today there's so many resources online, you can actually find the names of all of these 120 men online if you looked, or many of them. Shimon HaTzadik was in the beginning of the Mishnah of Avot, the Mishnah describes him as the last of the men of the Great Assembly. So he lived some 200 or 300 years later, around the time of Hanukkah, shortly before the story of Hanukkah. So the period of the men of the Great Assembly lasted from about 5th century until just before the story of Hanukkah. So right through from the period of the First Persian Empire, right through to the Hellenistic period, Alexander the Great, and right up to the story of Hanukkah. So that's the period of the men of the Great Assembly, and we're told that they were the ones who composed the Amidah and much of prayer that we have. Maimonides in his works actually says that Amidah was actually composed by Ezra himself. He doesn't write men of the Great Assembly. He attributes it specifically to Ezra directly. But that's the understanding of that quote from the Talmud, saying that the men of the Great Assembly were the ones who established the Amidah. So then obviously you got to get your head around the previous quote, which says that it was a student of Rabban Gamliel in Yavne at the time of 1st or 2nd century. So there are commentaries who make that observation, and they suggest that the language was a little bit fluid over time, over the period of 500, 600, 700 years. How the language of the Amidah exactly went became a little bit unclear, whatever it is, and it was this scholar who we mentioned on the previous screen, a student of Rabban Gamliel, Shimon HaPakuli. He was the one who put it in place. If you want to use the word Siddur again, he made an order and a structure very specific, and the prayer pretty much to what we understand it to be today. And there's language of it quoted in Talmud, etc. So we have some fairly good idea of how it was passed down. We've got the reference to Yavne, so I just want to give you a little bit of historic context. Yavne is a town still in Israel today, of course, in the south of Tel Aviv, somewhere halfway between Tel Aviv and Ashdod. So going down towards the Negev, in central Israel. Yavne was the base for Jewish scholarship after the destruction of Second Temple. In fact, there's a fascinating story in the Talmud that the sage Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was locked into Jerusalem during the Roman siege of Jerusalem. And he had a nephew who was a leader of a group of rebels who were determined to beat the Romans. It's a fascinating story how these people burnt down all of the supplies in Jerusalem because the rabbis, the leaders and the sages of the time wanted to negotiate with the Romans. They wanted to make peace with the Romans, and these young zealots felt that making peace would be a disastrous decision, and they said, no, we should be going to war, we should beat the Roman Empire, we'll have another miracle like Hanukkah. And clearly Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was of the opinion that you can't rely on miracles all the time. Hanukkah happened 100 years earlier, but let's not be so overly confident on ourselves. Let's be a little bit cautious, let's go and negotiate. So he faked dead with his nephew's advice. He faked dead and he left Jerusalem, and he went and met Vespasian, who at the time was still general. He famously greets Vespasian as Your Majesty, and Vespasian says to him, I'm not a king. So if I'm a king, so referring to me as Your Majesty makes you liable to the death penalty. You've just rebelled against Caesar in Rome. And while Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai is in there, a page boy comes in with a note, Caesar has died and you've just been appointed as new Caesar. So he realized that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai knew what he was doing. He said to Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, I'm going back to Rome. Chances are Jerusalem will be destroyed. I give you 3 requests. What do you want? And one of them was to build Yavne, to protect the city of Yavne and allow its scholars to continue to teach Judaism. And it was his foresight that ensured that Jewish scholarship would continue after the destruction of Jerusalem and for the next number of hundreds of years. And technically you can say that Jewish scholarship today is in large part what we have, the access to information that we have, Mishnah and Talmud, is in large part due to Yochanan ben Zakkai's ingenuity to convince the emperor to preserve some type of Jewish scholarship. So that's the era in which 1st, 2nd century is the era in which the Amidah is codified in the way that we understand it, which means that Jews have basically been saying the same prayers for 1900 years, which is pretty incredible if you think about it. The first time I went to Jerusalem was in the summer of 2003. It was a boiling hot day. I went to the Kotel, and I was hot, I was thirsty, I was tired, and I didn't connect. In fact, I spoke to a friend afterwards and I told him I found it quite a dull experience. So he told me that the late Adin Steinsaltz, great scholar, says that if you think that those stones have no heart, then you must have a heart of stone. So I said that's such a wonderful way to make me feel better about the fact that I didn't feel inspired at the wall. Tell me that I have a heart of stone. You could have told me something uplifting. You could have moved me in a meaningful way and given me some hope. But it's very interesting. I've thought about it many times since, about the fact that first time I didn't feel anything. And the next time I went, my mindset was, I need to feel something, because this is 2,000 years of Jewish history, longer, 3,000 years of Jewish history. I'm going to be saying prayers that Jews have been saying at this wall for 2,000 years. And I should connect with it. And I felt, I guess, a little bit guilty that first time I didn't. And every single time I've been subsequently, and I've been a few dozen times since, well, not a few dozen times, but certainly a dozen times since, I felt really, really moved and uplifted. And a big part of what goes through my mind is I'm connecting with the fact that Jews from Yavne would have made that trek to Jerusalem to pray at that same wall 1900 years ago, and why should I not connect as well? I want to look at earliest manuscripts. Obviously, when did the Siddur start getting organized? And it's very interesting that the first known written manuscript of prayer that we have is actually referred to as Seder Rav Amram, the order of Rav Amram. He wrote it as he was one of the Gaonim from the Gaonic period, which I'll just go through shortly on the next screen. But he was in Baghdad area. Again, Jews had been in that region for by that point, 1300 years, it was still that region from the destruction of First Temple until 10th, 11th century. The Baghdad region was, until the end of the Gaonic period, the Baghdad region was the hub of Jewish life, the Golders Green, the shtetl of Judaism. So Rav Amram Gon got this request from Jews of Spain, asking for manuscripts for prayer, and he responded by writing them a manuscript. The image that I put on the screen is actually published in, I made a note of it earlier, but I don't ever remember where, 1865. This is a print from 1865 that is compiled from what the sages of that time had as a tradition, was copies of that original manuscript. And that manuscript from Rav Amram Gon had a huge influence on European Jewry. It's mentioned in the writings of Rashi, in the Tosafot, and many of the subsequent scholars of 11th, 12th century Europe make reference to these manuscripts of Rav Amram Gon, and the fact that it was the first Siddur that was structured in that way, in an organized way. It's interesting to note that it wasn't just a Siddur. In fact, I'll just tell you, on this image, on the title page, it actually makes reference to the fact that this is a printing from what was organized some 1,000 years ago, and has been found in the handwritings of many of the earliest scholars, including Rashi, the Baalei Tosafot, the Rosh, the Tur, etc., some of the greatest scholars of the last 1,000 years. It's interesting that he didn't just have prayers in it. He had many additional addendums and various different prayers that different communities until today say at different times, not just during organized prayer. He also has a section of Jewish law that he writes in it. I guess it was a manual for daily life, for daily Jewish life, prayers plus many other things as well. The Rasag, Rav Sadia Gon, subsequently did a similar thing. When I come back to discussing various nusach, I'll come back to mentioning something interesting about Rav Sadia Gon's manuscript and how it influenced that region. But again, Rav Sadia Gon was also from the Gaonic period, so also from that Baghdad region, some 100 years later, less than 100 years after Rav Amram Gon, and he also did a similar thing, writing a manuscript which was passed down and which we still know of today. Of course, there may have been other manuscripts written in that period, but we obviously don't have access to them. We don't know much about them today. There's a very famous machzor called a machzor Vitri, which is actually written in the same format, laws and commentary, etc., written by a student of Rashi. It's actually interesting because the first known manuscript of the Machzor Vitri is actually written a few years was actually completed a few years after the original author passed away. He was a rabbi called Reb Simcha, son of Samuel, son of Shmuel, one of the students of Rashi, who lived in the 11th century. And the Machzor Vitri is a very, very important text until today. That original manuscript has had huge influence on the modern text of prayer that we have. And then, of course, we have Maimonides. Maimonides, of course, if you go to the Geniza in Oxford, you can see the manuscripts of Maimonides' works. Maimonides, at the end of his laws of prayer, actually writes, he has the whole structure of daily prayer. It's actually very interesting. In Chabad communities, we have a tradition that we study 3 chapters of Maimonides' laws every day. So if you go through the whole of Maimonides' laws every day, at one point on one day, your reading is going to be daily prayer. Because it's included in his works. So if we're reading through the whole book, one day you're going to read daily prayer. And I always find it quite humorous because I do my morning prayer, and then at some point during the day, on that day when I get to that part of Maimonides' works, I have to say the prayers again because I'm reading his book. And it's like, well, I should have done this in the morning. Start doing it again just because I'm studying, and then it's part of the text, so we read all the prayers. So Maimonides, again, 12th century, and a very important resource, and certainly very similar. Of course, there are variations, and we'll see why. I mean, it obviously makes sense that there are going to be variations over Maimonides being a leader of what we might call today the Sephardic community, well, he was from Spain, so rightfully so, to be called the Sephardic community, the original Sephardic Jews. Of course, escaped and went to Egypt. But there's, you can see in Maimonides from 800 years ago, clearly the structure of prayer as we know it was already well established. Okay, so I mentioned that I would just describe briefly the Gaonic period. So Matamachsia is a town in the Baghdad region, which the Talmud already speaks about. It talks about the alleyways of Matamachsia, and it says that it's a reference to the yeshiva, the great institution of scholarship that existed in the city of Sura, which was in that region, in that area. And then of course there was another town that the Talmud also describes that was a place of great Jewish scholarship called Pumpadita. This was already at time of second expulsion, but by the period of the Talmud, so going to 4th, 5th century, right up till the end of the Gaonic period, 11th century, that area around the Baghdad region was, as we said, a really important base for Jewish life. And this is, I actually found this on Chabad website, but this is an image of a manuscript of a letter that was written by a scholar at the time of the Gaonic period, which is still able to be seen today. But the Gaonic period itself, the Talmud period finishes 6th century, and then the Gaonic period begins after that, so 7th to 11th century. So clearly by the end of the Gaonic period, the end of the 11th century, prayer as we know it was very much well established. The Jews have been saying the same things for over 1,000 years. Yeah, I can imagine on Fiddler on the Roof somebody saying, isn't it time to say something else for a change? Alright, earliest printing of a Siddur. So the Sonsino press, a famous Sonsino press in Italy, printed a Siddur, Nusach Rome, the Roman version of the Siddur, their version in 1486. That's pretty impressive. I've got an image on this when I was putting this together earlier, and I put in the Sonsino press. It reminded me of this very famous Bomberg Talmud. So the Sonsino press were the first ones to publish the Talmud, to print the Talmud, and subsequently another printer in the same region in Italy set up his own printing press called the Bomberg Talmud. Now apparently the story goes, I'm going to dedicate what I'm saying now in honor of a lady called Avigail Bat Rut Shosha, a lady who's unfortunately unwell and needs our prayers. She should have a full recovery, and she should be blessed to have many years of nachas and good health and good news from her family. This is a story about her father. The lady who I just mentioned, her father was the late Jack Lunza, and he was a book collector, a very, very prominent book collector. And he discovered that the Bomberg Talmud is in Westminster Abbey. He set up a collection called the Vala Madonna Trust Library. How did this Talmud end up in England? So apparently the legend goes, apparently this is true, but you're welcome to find other sources to dispute me on this one. But apparently they say that when Henry VIII decided he wanted to get divorced, we all know the story. Well, we all know part of the story. We know that he set up Church of England because the Catholic Church wouldn't allow him to get divorced. So he set up a new religion so that he can get divorced. But apparently his scholars and advisors told him before that Judaism allows divorce. In fact, there's a famous joke, because actually in Talmud, in Talmud, first you have the book of divorce, Gittin, and then you have the book of Kiddushin, the laws of marriage. So there's a famous joke, why do you have the book of divorce before you have the book of marriage? And they say because the Talmud were smart enough to give us the antidote, the medicine, before they gave us the disease. Tim, you're allowed to laugh at that one. So the story is told that Henry VIII, when he wanted to get divorced, his scholars told him, Judaism allows divorce. It doesn't make sense that the Catholic Church should ban it. So he said, well, how can we prove that? So they said, well, what you need to do is commission a Talmud from Italy. That's where they're printing Talmud. And once you get a volume of Talmud, you'll be able to prove it. Now, apparently in those years, You couldn't order something on Amazon next day from Italy and get it very quickly. Took a while. And by the time the Talmud arrived in England, he had lost patience. He set up the Anglican Church and it got divorced. So they didn't need the Talmud anymore. So they just stuffed it in the library, and that was the end of that. Until Jack Lunza found out about it and managed in a very creative way to get hold of some documents that the Abbey wanted. And he told them, we'll do an exchange. I'll give you these documents, you give me the Talmud. So an amazing story of early Jewish printing, but of course the Bomberg Talmud was the Bombergs started their printing shortly after the Sonsino Press were the first ones, as far as I understand, to print a prayer book. All right, Nusach. Nusach is two Jews, three opinions. How do you have so many variations? I was telling somebody recently that there are 46 different ways to put on tefillin. There's got to be multiple different approaches to things. Somebody actually sent me a question this morning. If everything is God's word, how can there be variation? Now, I'm not going to go into that now. We'll leave that for another time. Tim, if you want a more religious talk on another occasion with less academic twist on it, we can cover that theme. But of course we know
that I'm enthusiastic. Salmon.
So let's just go through it. Just a few examples of nusach, different versions of prayer. The image on the screen is actually a handwritten manuscript of the Luria version of prayer, the Ari's version of prayer, which I'll come to in a moment. We refer to most Sephardim refer to the Sephardic version of prayer today, the mainstream, what you might call the mainstream Sephardic version of prayer today, as Edut HaMizrach, the congregation of the East. Actually, within the Sephardic communities themselves, there's variations. You're going to have Spanish Jewry's Nusach, which is going to be obviously very heavily influenced by Maimonides' writings and Ibn Ezra and other scholars of Spain and that region. Yemenite Jews are going to have their own region. The Persian and Bukharian Jews actually follow a version which actually has quite distinct variations to it to mainstream Jews. If anything, the Ashkenaz use Maimonides more than Persian and Bukharian. Persian and Bukharian Jews are using a version from Rav Sadia Gaon, who I mentioned earlier. So Rav Sadia Gaon's manuscript remained in Persia and had a huge influence on that community. And Bukharian Jews are actually descended from Persian Jews, so they took editions of those manuscripts with them. Then you've got mainstream Nusach Ashkenaz, the mainstream Ashkenaz version of the Siddur. You've got Ari, the Lurianic version, which is used primarily by people today who the Hasidic community mainly use the Luria Ari, what we call Nusach Ari. Chabad has a unique Nusach Ari that was actually heavily edited by the founder of Chabad, who I'm actually incidentally named after, Reb Shneur Zalman of Liadi, some 250 years ago. So he did a lot of research into what he believed was the most accurate version of the Luria edition of the Siddur, and he adapted based on what he felt was the most accurate, and that's the Siddur that Chabad used today. And in fact, if you look at a Chabad Siddur, you'll see it says Luria, but then it says as put together by Reb Shneur Zalman of Liadi. There is a version which I always find very, very quite humorous in a way, called Nusach Sfard. Now you would think if you went into a synagogue or you went to a bookshop and you saw Nusach Sfard, you'd be forgiven for making the mistake that it actually means a Sephardic prayer book. No Sephardic Jew, as far as I know, prays Nusach Sfard. Nusach Sfard is actually a Lurianic Siddur. It's actually an Ashkenaz Siddur with Lurianic influence. So it's used by the Hasidic communities. And when they say Nusach Sfard, they mean Luria, and they're calling it Sfard because he lived in Tzfat in an era when most Jews living in Israel at that time were Sephardic Jews, and they brought this Siddur to Europe, so they nicknamed it Nusach Sfard. if you're ever looking for an Art Scroll prayer book and you're Sephardi, don't buy the Art Scroll Nusach Sfard. It's not the book you want. The book you want is Nusach Sfardim, or Nusach Edut HaMizrach. And Nusach Sfard is for Hasidic Jews who pray an Ashkenaz Lurianic influence. There's also something called Nusach Anglia. If you'll indulge me for a minute, I find the Nusach Anglia very humorous because there are some changes that happened in Nusach Anglia over the years which are quite curious. One of them, most distinctly, that I found quite fascinating is that Nusach Anglia is the only prayer book which, after the Amidah on festivals, after the repetition of the Amidah on festivals, before the Hallel is recited, they recite Kaddish. If you look in any other prayer book, Kaddish comes after the Hallel. So we know that on festivals, also on the first of each Hebrew month, on the Rosh Chodesh, after the repetition of the Amidah, we recite Hallel, which is sections from Tehillim, which are songs of praise, specifically said on a Jewish festival. Kaddish is recited after Hallel. Now there are these old Nusach Anglia, they don't use it anymore. The rabbis clarified that it was an error, and the reason why it became an error is quite a humorous and curious thing. What happened was that the machers of the congregation came to synagogue Jewish meantime. They all came late. Now on a Jewish festival, the cantor and the choir would start performing at the beginning of Hallel. So it was a big deal. Hallel was when you wanted to be in shul. That was when the performance with the cantor and the whatever, if you can imagine what Anglo synagogues looked like 100 years ago, full to the rafters, and everyone had come to hear the cantor and the choir entertain. So they want the wealthy machers who came late wanted to hear Hallel, but they all came late with their top hats and everything else. So they actually caused a delay in the service. What happened was they had such influence that they made the rabbinic leaders delay after the Amidah was finished. The congregation had to just sit and wait until the machers with their top hats had shown up ready for the cantor, ready for the performance. So there was a delay in the service. There's not allowed to be a delay in the service after the Amidah. So the rabbi said, well, if there's going to be a delay in the service, there has to be a Kaddish at the end of the Amidah before that delay. So that's a curious Nusach Anglia, a British custom that was eventually abolished when the rabbi sat around and said, actually, there's no basis for this. There should be no delay. The Kaddish belongs at the end of Hallel. Let's do it the way it's supposed to be. All right. The concept of synagogue. So there's a fascinating, why we pray in synagogues? Why don't we just pray at home? And actually, I'd like to advocate, if you consider the whole difficulties of COVID, I'd like to suggest that COVID should give us pause for thought on the ability that we have to actually perform the mitzvah of prayer in our own homes, in our own space, in our own time, even without Zoom. Just take a prayer book and find a meaningful moment to pray. But of course, we do know at the same time that Judaism does emphasize communal prayer. In fact, as you can see here, there's a wonderful description in Talmud Sukkah about this giant synagogue in Alexandria of Egypt. This is describing, obviously, from Talmudic times, so this is 2nd, 3rd century, which also gives you a bit of a glimpse into how the Talmud is suggesting that there was an established system of prayer in synagogues outside of Jerusalem's destroyed temple in 2nd, 3rd, 4th century. So it describes this wonderful structure, this amazing building. And then it says there was a bima, that not to be confused with this little synagogue over here. There was a wooden platform in the center. The sexton of the synagogue, the warden, would stand on the platform with scarves in his hand, and when they reached a point where the congregation was supposed to say Amen, he waved those scarves like flags, and the thousands of people in the synagogue knew now was the time to shout Amen. I don't know if there was a ripple effect. It took time before everyone could see the flag, so maybe the Amen took time. But yeah, talk about the contrast between our little cozy synagogue in Southampton versus the great synagogue. Tim, you've never felt the need to wave flags from, or Martin, you've never felt the need to wave flags so that the congregation should answer Amen after one of Barry's blessings. Nowadays we all have a little flag. Yeah, I see you're waving a face mask. The next part of that description of the Talmud is one of the original sources for the argument that no one should ever say the rabbis didn't have a good sense of humor. Okay, we see it right here. The rabbis absolutely had a good sense of humor, because the Talmud continues and tells us that there was absolute segregation of classes in that synagogue in Alexandria. They would not sit mingled. The goldsmiths among themselves, the silversmiths among themselves, the blacksmiths, the coppersmiths, the weavers. And when a pauper walked into the synagogue as a first timer, as a visitor, he would recognize, he would identify where was his corner, where was he supposed to go, where were the people of his craft. He would turn to them, and then he would chat, he would explain to them he had no job, and there was a network. So you didn't want to, if you were a silversmith, you didn't want to end up praying with the blacksmiths, because you never get a job. So the Talmud says that despite the segregation of classes, it was a wonderful opportunity for poor people to be able to support their families, because it was a great place to network and find a job. Which also suggests that there was plenty of talking in that synagogue. So the rabbi says, quiet, we're in the middle of the service, to say, actually, the Talmud tells us that people found employment in the synagogue. What do you mean quiet? There's a service going on. How did they find employment in Alexandria if they weren't talking? So, just continuing on that theme, the idea, and you know, we could spend all day looking at the sources of the idea of synagogue prayer. Just very quickly, some quotes from Talmud about the importance of communal prayer. There is definitely an emphasis in Judaism about communal prayer, but as I said, at the same time, it's important to also recognize the value of personal prayer too. So the Talmud tells us that it was taught by a scholar called Abba Binyamin that once prayer is only heard in a synagogue. It's important to understand actually the language of the Talmud. When the Talmud says once prayer is only heard, the Hebrew for that, Ein tefillah shel adam nishmat ella, is actually used to say it's better to, not that it isn't heard at all. It's a style of language that doesn't translate from the original Hebrew well to the English, because if you translate it literally, it means that your prayer is only heard in the synagogue. But what the Talmud really is saying, and there's many examples of this type of language in Talmud, such and such a thing is only means X, Y, and Z, but we know that it already means something else, and we've confirmed it already means. So obviously it's not rejecting personal prayer, but it's saying that there is value of prayer in a synagogue, as it is stated, to listen to the song and the prayer. In the place of song, there prayer should be. Where is song? Where is cantor? Where is the choir? Where is our congregation singing together? Despite what we might think that singing in the shower is a good thing to do by yourself, actually the best way to sing is with a congregation, to sing together, and therefore from that verse we learn that prayer should also be done with the community, ideally. Talmud continues, from where do we know that the Holy One, blessed be He, is located in a synagogue? How do we know God's in the synagogue? And he has a quote for that from Psalms, God stands in the congregation of God. And then finally, from where do we know that 10 people who pray, the divine presence is with them? How do we know that you need 10 men for the minyan? So it gives this quote from here, God stands in the congregation of God. Again, a quote from Talmud. You see the value of Jewish prayer. Actually interesting, I picked up a student yesterday. I took a student yesterday to synagogue here in Brighton, and after the evening service, he asked me, why is there no repetition of the Amidah after Ma'ariv? So I explained to him that technically the sages established the morning and afternoon prayer, Shacharit and Mincha, as an official obligation. Ma'ariv doesn't have the same level of obligation. The reason why the repetition was established at all was to give opportunity for people who didn't know how to say it to hear the cantor saying it. So everyone said it quietly, and then it was repeated for those who didn't know how to pray. And that became, by the times of the Mishnah already, it became an established fact, and that continued until today, of course. So we say the repetition. But it's interesting, you're not allowed in Judaism, it said in Jewish law, you're allowed to say the Amidah as many times as you want in a day, But each time you say it, you have to add a variation. So you can say Shacharit, you can say the morning Amidah 10 times, if you wanted to. I'm not sure why you would want to. But if you wanted to, you could say it 10 times. But in each one, you'd have to add a variation that you hadn't said in the previous. Which is why we add Kadusha, the extra parts that are added in the repetition, the Kadusha, Kadosh, 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 that we recite in the repetition of the Amidah that's not said in the silent Amidah, that is done in order that there's a variation in the repetition. So, people say, I want to pray with a congregation, I want to say Kedusha. Actually, if we're praying by ourselves, that is great value to that. And we might not say the Kedusha, but it's still of great value. There is a reason, the reason why Kedusha is added and the reason why we only say that with a minyan, is because that is the variation to be said when it's being recited a second time, because the congregation have already said it silently. Alright, so where does the word tefillah come from? I'm looking at the time, I want to try and wrap up in the next 2-3 minutes, but just very quickly, the word tefillah actually, according to it's not used in, it's related to the word tefillin. We use it loosely for the word prayer, but actually according to Jewish scholarship, it's not used. The word is not used in this context in modern Hebrew, but we're told in classical Hebrew that it actually means a firm connection, a firm knot, which is why tefillin is called tefillin, because it's got the knot on it with which we connect it to the arm and the head. I tried to get a picture of a boy in Southampton having his bar mitzvah wearing tefillin, and hopefully you can see a bit of the knot over there, and of course the knot over there. So you've got the knots on the tefillin. Essentially what we're saying is the reason why prayer is called tefillah is because prayer is the way in which we connect. The word tefillah related to the word connect, it's the way we connect with God and with our soul, with our purpose. In fact, we also use the word in Chabad circles, we use the word based on actually a quote from Maimonides that I showed you earlier, which we have of course in the Shema, to serve God. Prayer is avodah. We refer to it as avodah shebalev, and we actually say that prayer is actually hard work. It's actually a really grueling but equally uplifting journey towards ourselves and the journey towards our relationship with God. So it's a very deep connection type of thing. Prayer should be seen. I know a lot of Jewish people don't see it in this way, and this will lead me to the final screen. We don't see it necessarily as a spiritual experience, but if we take the time to study and look at the various texts, actually prayer is a deeply spiritual experience. Aleinu. I'll finish off with this. Aleinu is the final prayer, and I've said to many people over the years, I find one of the curiosities of Aleinu, the beauty of Aleinu, is the fact that it's such a poetic and rich, wonderful prayer, coming right at the end of the service. I started off with a story about that rabbi being frustrated that he couldn't concentrate in prayer. So I've told many people, if you're frustrated that you can't concentrate in prayer, don't worry, there's a beautiful prayer at the end. Aleinu is a wonderful, wonderful prayer. It's poetic, it's rich. In fact, I had a student here recently who doesn't connect with poetry in the way that more artistic type people might. And he asked me to show him some prayer. I'm showing him Aleinu, and he was a little bit confused. Like, what is this Aleinu? I don't relate to it. So I summarized it for him, and he felt so uplifted. Actually, Aleinu has 2 paragraphs. The first paragraph of Aleinu is we acknowledge God's existence. We acknowledge the fact that we're just mundane human beings. In a summary of the whole of that paragraph is, there is but one God, and everything that I engage with and everything that I experience in my life is enabled because of that one God, and the whole universe and the whole world and the whole universe and everything I experience is connected to that one God. That's the first paragraph. The second paragraph is, and it is our job to reveal that in the whole world. In fact, he uses the language letaken olam, the word tikkun olam, which tikkun olam doesn't just mean to lobby for better human rights for people in difficult climates and difficult places, but tikkun olam means to actually fix the world by revealing divine light. That's our job. It's a beautiful poetic prayer, very rich prayer. So I want to share a story, and then I'm going to come back to Barry and summarize and finish off reflecting on this prayer and connecting it to Barry. There's a story about the late Reb Levi Yitzchak of Berditchev, a great Hasidic master from some 250 years ago. He's actually an ancestor of my children, an ancestor of my wife. I'm descended from some shoemaker in the shtetl, and my wife and children are descended from the greats of the shtetl. So they're descended from this great rabbi, Reb Levi Yitzchak of Berditchev. So it tells a story. He was a wonderful man. He's known in circles who know of him as the Ohev Yisrael, a man who absolutely loved every Jew. He would never say anything bad about another Jew. So they say that somebody once came over to him really angry and said, "See all the Jewish wagon drivers outside the synagogue? They're all oiling the wheels of their wagons, getting ready for work, while they're finishing the Aleinu prayer. They haven't finished praying yet. They're still saying this final prayer, Aleinu, by heart. They're already outside the synagogue oiling their wheels." They dashed out before the service finished and are mumbling the last words outside. So the Berditchever looks up to heaven and he says, "Almighty God, look at your wonderful children. Even when they're oiling their wagon wheels, they're saying the prayer of Aleinu." As I said, I think Aleinu is a very poetic prayer, and I think a lot of our prayers are very, very poetic. And of course, Barry had a talent for art, and I think it's right to say that if poetry is a wonderful form of art, we all know that, and Barry had a real talent and appreciation for art, and of course a talent and appreciation for his synagogue and his prayer as well. So I think as we finish off, it's a good time to reflect on the value of this prayer Aleinu, to recognize the beauty of the poetic language of our prayers, and how we can paint wonderful paintings of our relationship with God, and hopefully make prayer meaningful through a deeper understanding of prayer. And that is my presentation. I hope you've enjoyed it.
Turning on our microphone. Does anybody have any questions? I have some questions, but does anybody want to say anything?
I'm sorry, I know this was partly for my dad, this particular meeting, and I'm sorry I wasn't there sooner. Thank you for those who did attend in respect of a memory from my father. I know he'd be very happy to see you. I'm sure he's looking down on everyone right now. I am sorry I wasn't here sooner. It's my fault for not realizing exactly what time this meeting was, but I'm glad I did actually manage to catch the end of it. So thank you, Rabbi, on behalf of our family and on behalf of my dad.
My pleasure. You heard the part you needed to hear.
I did. I'm glad I did manage to catch the.
But I think Joe, I think there's a recording.
I'll have to.
Recording, so you can watch.
Yeah,
if you set it up right in the right way, we can watch you watching it. You can record yourself watching the recording.
I might not publish the recording of me watching the recording, but if someone could send me the link to the recording, I'd be really happy. I know this is probably not the right place to be mentioning this, but I have already arranged a joint stone setting for both my mum and my dad on the 10th of October. So whoever would like to come, it'd be 10 a.m. In the Jewish cemetery in Southampton on the 10th of October. So anyone who would like to come, please come. I will be arranging some kind of after event, but details to follow. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Joe, for coming. I was hoping that we would see you. And you're looking just like the pictures of your dad when he was young.
I know. It was a long time ago, though, but yeah. Thank you.
Salman, these are stupid questions. You were telling us about Yochanan ben Zakkai and how he came out of Jerusalem.
Yes.
Well, now, I'd always thought that this was not really true, but in some sense was a sort of a story that we tell in order to dignify the continuation.
Can't hear you, Tim.
Huh?
Can't hear you.
Speak up a little bit more.
Couldn't hear anything.
Can you hear me now?
Yes,
Yeah.
go on.
Okay, right. So my question is about Yochanan ben Zakkai. Now, Zalman told the story about Yochanan ben Zakkai, who is supposed to have exited, I think, in a coffin from Jerusalem. And if you read Josephus, you'll know that Josephus regarded the zealots in Jewish zealots rather perhaps as Fatah. So my question is, do we really believe that story, that he came out in a coffin and talked to Vespasian and so on and so forth? My feeling had always been that it was an apocryphal story rather than one that was literally true.
Okay, so the first thing I'll say to you is actually the sages of the time, Talmud, etc., also view the zealots, the biryonim, is the term that they're referred to in the Talmud. I'm not going to use terms of modern terrorist organizations, but they certainly did not see them in a very positive light at all. In fact, Talmud takes the time to tell us in detail what the vast quantities of supplies that they destroyed were, leaving the city in extreme famine. My expertise is not in the secular academic world. My expertise is in Talmud. I read a story in the Talmud and I shared it. Can I tell you what secular scholars think of whether the story happened or not? That's more your academic line. I don't know. To me, it doesn't matter. I must say, when I read these stories, it's more about what you get from them. I'm happy to say it did. I'm happy to say it didn't.
Can I just share our memories of Aleinu? And they very much relate to Joey, who, as a young man, I say much younger man, was the person that Barry always called on to sing Aleinu in our services. And we have fond memories of that, Joey.
Oh, thank you, Miriam. It's the only thing I can remember how to sing, I think, more than anything else. So by default, I ended up being the person who was always called on to sing it. I'm not sure if I can still remember it, but
I didn't even know that.
Thanks for sharing those memories, Miriam. It's really kind.
If I could fill the space, I mean, I think Barry would have enjoyed that a lot. So thank you very much. I did have a question, which may be more on the academic than the religious side. What was the significance of the 9th century CE?
I didn't hear the last few words. What was
the significance of the 9th century of the Common Era? So the reason I asked the question is because it sounded from your presentation as though the year 872 was quite pivotal, because that's the year in which one of the Geonim decided that it was necessary to codify an order of service for what became a Siddur. So why that juncture?
My understanding of it is simply that those are the manuscripts that lasted.
Okay, so it's an accident of history rather than a result of history.
Yeah, that's what I understand. From what I understand, 11th century Germanic scholars, other than the main texts of Talmud and Mishnah, what type of text, and of course the Torah scroll itself, what type of text of individual texts and individual writings and prayer books, if anything, had survived and got around long enough to be able to come from Babylonia from hundreds of years before. There may be more to it, but from what I understand, it's just, I mean, the Gaonic period was very influential in many ways, but from what my understanding of it is specifically that reference that we're referring to was more about the fact that those manuscripts were were written and preserved, and again, they were written and preserved because Jews of Spain were asking for them. So obviously Babylonia was having an influence on Jews who were quite detached from the. So I guess there may be an element of that as well. The fact that the 9th century there was enough international trade, etc., going on that the Gaonim were able to influence the budding communities of Southern Europe.
Thanks. I'm afraid I'm going to have to leave you now, but again, thank you very much for
Thank you.
very interesting. And as I said, I think Barry and no doubt Linda as well would have very much enjoyed that. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, Ben.
And can I add my thanks as well? Interesting, much to ponder. But I also will slip away now. Goodbye to all.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, so probably now is a time to call a halt. Is this going to be available? Salman, is it available? I mean, the recording, is it available?
Yeah, I can send it to you. Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, I am in discussions about improving our website, and so it might be something that we want to have access to, and I'll follow up on. I certainly will follow up on some. Is there anybody else who wants to add something?